I think design space and gameplay environment are two really big factors that come into play when balancing card games, both in terms of choosing what to hit, restrict, or unrestrict on the ban list, and in terms of designing cards for new sets. For that reason, we're going to look at Crimson Dragon and Metamorphosis because both of these cards occupy a similar design space, and thus I think you'd want to have similar considerations for both of them in terms of overall game balance. Now, Metamorphosis is a card that was released in 2003 and it was banned, I think, in September of 2007. This card was frequently used in conjunction with Scapegoat to cheat out Thousand Eyes Restrict, but you'd also at times see it used to get into cards such as Reaper on the Nightmare, Dark Balter the Terrible, and Fiend Skull Dragon. With Dark Balter and Fiend Skull, they each have a restriction, but this restriction doesn't stop Metamorphosis because Metamorphosis is just a special summon. These cards say a fusion summon of this monster can only be conducted with the above fusion material monsters. What this means is if you try to use a card like Instant Fusion to cheat them out because they are both level 5, it won't work because even though Instant Fusion is a fusion summon, it does not meet their material requirements. Likewise, if you wanted to use a fusion substitute monster like King of the Swamp, it just doesn't work with these. In a similar vein to the instant fusion thing, Crimson Dragon cannot summon Cosmic Quasar, which was released in the same set, because it specifically states must first be synchro summoned with the above materials, right? It can fill the synchro summon requirement, but it can't fill the material requirement. And this is a balancing factor that was put in place, obviously, because both of these cards are in the same set. But that means your older synchros don't have this same luxury. And that also means going forward into the future, more synchro monsters may be printed with this line of text just to stop them from being abused with the Crimson Dragon, right? And while I think that's like a bit of a fair thing to do, especially with these higher level monsters, you shouldn't have to play around with needing that restriction on everything that's lower level. Because looking at Metamorphosis, this card and other really old cards that could cheat fusion monsters out of the extra deck are likely the reason that early GX fusions, such as the Elemental Heroes, mostly have the line of text must be fusion summon, right? And if we look at the total list of fusion monsters, out of the 471 total, only 68 of them have the text must be fusion sum. If we add a period, it goes down to 43. And it's very important to have these restrictions in place at times as a way to balance cards, but it's a bit egregious that, like, really look at all of the elemental heroes that have this line of text just to prevent them from being abused by things that cheat out fusion cards, right? It's kind of egregious, but it's something that we had to live with. And this line of text is very impactful because it means you can't use cards like Monster Reborn on monsters that say this. You can't use cards like Premature Burial, Call the Haunted, or whatever other revive effects that you may have, right? It makes the longevity of these cards much worse because of restriction that was put in place due to something else being problematic, right? And that was my overall issue with Crimson Dragon. Yes, you can ban King Calamity, but the fact of the matter is, King Calamity's summoning restriction has, up until this point, actually mattered. Even though sometimes people would come out with strategies to try and turbo into this, it was never really all that consistent because the materials you needed to go into this guy on your opponent's turn were a bit of a tall ask. So the opportunity cost was usually just not really worth it, right? But Crimson Dragon kind of removes that on multiple axes because you can make something like Baron de Fleur, search out Synchro World when you make the Crimson Dragon, and then you can just modulate the Baron de Fleur's level to 11 or 12 to get into the card that you want to. But like again, if you get rid of King Calamity, now your opponent has to deal with Supernova. Okay, you get rid of Supernova, they have to deal with Blazar. Get rid of that, got to deal with Seifer. Get rid of that, got to deal with Quasar. Okay, now you just banned a bunch of cards for the sake of keeping this thing in rotation, and it's just gonna get a bunch of new targets and new Dragon Synchro monsters that are level 7 or higher that are meant to be somewhat restrictive now need to have a line of text like Cosmic Quasars to prevent abuse by Crimson Dragon. But what if their own archetype has an effect like Crimson Dragon for, let's say they release a Speedroid, right, that can cheat out one of your other Speedroid Synchros when it dies? Well, now they have to be very roundabout in making these cards work because they need to play around the Crimson Dragon. It's kind of silly to have to deal with that, right? And then even once you get rid of all the level 12s, you got this thing. You're going to ban this too, even though this thing in a vacuum is not a problem. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And you also have these cards, like they can't be synchro summoned in the first place. They have a special summoning condition, so Crimson Dragon can't go into them either. But I mean, Ultimaya is a much more balanced card. It specifically gets out a level 7 or 8 Dragon Synchro monster, and because it specifically activates when a Speller Trap is set on your field, there are like a couple of interesting ways you can utilize this card. You could actually summon out a dragon on your opponent's turn by using a card to set a Speller Trap, right? It makes for some interesting gameplay. But Crimson Dragon just lends itself to a unhealthy gameplay environment because it's kind of the Helka Firebrax situation, right? They kept hitting tuners to keep that card around, but Helk was one of the biggest problems that whole time. Hitting tuners didn't change that fact. If anything, it made it that much more apparent because no matter how many tuners you hit, Helk kept being at the forefront of these combos and being the juncture point that allowed for a lot of the plays. So at the end of the day, Helk was the card that needed to get hit, and it finally did get hit. Are we going to experience the exact same thing with Crimson Dragon, even though using Metamorphosis as a very old example, right? These cards are basically doing the same thing, and they are infecting the gameplay environment in similar ways. That's just my thought, but yeah, I think it's often glossed over the impact that a card can have on designing new cards in the future. And again, like there's probably even better examples than this, but Metamorphosis and the early GX fusions were just one of the most obvious to me. Coupled with the fact that, again, you look at the vast majority of fusions that have been released in the past 2 decades, and most of them do not have this restriction. They don't need to have the restriction because we don't really have many cards like this anymore. The only thing that I think would be kind of interesting to see would be more restrictions like this, or what is that card called? There was a new Gaia in the OCG. This guy, right? This thing has a restriction that makes it so you can't actually use tier limit monsters to make this. And it's kind of funny because I remember a lot of people were really upset with this card because they're like, well, you can't make it as easy as you could before. And this is a consequence of the exact same thing, right? If we're gonna have tier limits in our meta, in our gameplay space, then sometimes it's going to necessitate that cards be balanced by having summoning conditions like this. So you can't just slap this into a tier deck. But yeah, that's all I had to say. Y'all have a good day. I'm going to hope I stop sneezing profusely. Later.